Most mornings begin the same way. The first light slips quietly through the trees. A faint blue glow settles across the yard. The air is still cool enough that you can see a hint of movement in the grass when the breeze passes through. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barks once. Then, everything becomes quiet again. And right on cue, the blue jays arrive. One lands on a cedar branch near the edge of the yard. Another appears a few seconds later, flashing that familiar blue between the leaves before settling into place. Their calls cut through the morning stillness, sharp and unmistakable. If you've spent enough years watching birds, the scene feels almost permanent, as though these bright flashes of blue have always been here and always will be. But one morning, a strange thought appears. Not dramatic, not frightening, just a small question that drifts into your mind and refuses to leave. You see blue jays everywhere, in neighborhoods, parks, backyards, along country roads. You hear them in summer, you hear them in fall, you hear them long before you see them, yet somehow, despite all those years, despite all those mornings, despite all those thousands of encounters, you almost never see one at the end of its life. The realization arrives quietly, the way certain truths do. You stare toward the branch where the blue jay is perched. The sunlight catches the feathers along its back. It looks as alive as the morning itself. And yet, something about that question lingers. Where do they go? If you are new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you are about to discover may change the way you look at every bird that visits your yard. Because this is where the mystery begins, not with what we see, but with what seems to vanish without a trace. And the deeper you look into that silence, the stranger it becomes. And the strange thing is, the moment that question enters your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore. You start reaching back through your memories almost without realizing it. Morning walks through quiet neighborhoods, long drives down winding country roads, afternoons spent sitting on a porch with a cup of coffee cooling beside you, entire seasons passing outside your window. The birds were always there, perched on telephone wires, hopping through the grass, calling from somewhere deep inside the trees. They felt woven into the landscape itself, as familiar as the sound of wind moving through leaves. And yet, when you try to remember something else, something that should be just as common, your memory becomes strangely empty. Most people know this feeling. They simply never stop long enough to examine it. There is often a moment when the realization arrives unexpectedly. Maybe while watching a blue jay land on a fence post, maybe while hearing one call from somewhere beyond the yard. You pause, just for a second, and a quiet thought surfaces. If these birds have always been here, where are all the ones that came before? The question is not disturbing in the way people usually mean. It feels deeper than that, more reflective, almost like standing in an old forest and suddenly becoming aware of how many seasons have passed beneath those branches before you arrived. Something about it feels larger than the bird itself, larger than the yard, because what you are really noticing is absence. Not dramatic absence, not obvious absence, the kind that hides inside ordinary life so completely that most people spend decades looking right through it. But once you notice it, you begin seeing the outline of a mystery that was there all along. And this is where things start to become difficult to explain away. The deeper you sit with that question, the more unusual the world outside your window begins to feel. Not because anything has changed. The blue jays still arrive. The morning light still spills across the lawn. The branches still sway in the same breeze they always have. Everything appears exactly as it did before. But now you are looking at it differently. And sometimes that is where every hidden world begins. Watch a blue jay for a moment. Really watch it. Notice how quickly it moves between trees. How naturally it disappears into dense leaves where your eyes can no longer follow. One second, it is perched in full view. The next, it is simply gone. Not vanished in any mysterious sense, just absorbed into a landscape that seems designed to conceal more than it reveals. The longer people spend around birds, the more they notice something remarkable. Most of a bird's life happens beyond human attention. The nest is hidden. The resting places are hidden. The routes they travel often pass high above rooftops without anyone noticing. Even their daily routines unfold largely beyond our awareness. We see brief moments, small windows, A flash of blue on a fence post. A silhouette crossing the evening sky. A call echoing from somewhere deep in the trees, but the larger story remains out of sight. And perhaps that is why this mystery feels so persistent. We tend to assume that if something important happens, we would see it. Yet nature rarely works that way. Some of its most significant processes happen quietly, behind curtains of leaves, beneath layers of grass, inside thickets no person ever enters. The strange realization is this: what feels unusual may not be the disappearance itself. It may be how little of the natural world we were ever seeing to begin with. And once that possibility enters your mind, an even deeper question begins to emerge. That deeper question begins with something surprisingly simple. If what you are noticing is real, then it should leave traces. Somewhere. Somehow. Yet the longer researchers study natural ecosystems, the more they discover that the living world operates with a level of efficiency that feels almost invisible from a human perspective. Walk through a forest after sunrise. Listen carefully. The birds are already moving. Insects are already active. Tiny organisms beneath the soil are already doing work that no one sees. Every hour, countless interactions unfold around you without announcement or spectacle. Most people imagine nature as something vast and slow, but in reality, many processes begin almost immediately. Researchers who study ecosystems often describe them less as a collection of separate creatures and more as an ongoing conversation, one life touching another, one movement creating the conditions for the next. A fallen leaf rarely stays unchanged for long. A fallen branch gradually becomes part of the forest floor. Even the oldest trees eventually return their energy to the landscape around them. Nothing remains isolated forever. And perhaps that is where our intuition starts to sense something before our minds fully understand it. Because deep down, we know we are surrounded by systems that have been refining themselves for millions of years. Systems that do not require witnesses. Systems that continue whether anyone is paying attention or not. When you look out at a blue jay perched high in a maple tree, what you are seeing is only one visible moment in a much larger cycle. A cycle so complete, so seamless, that most of it escapes human notice entirely. And this is where the mystery begins to shift. Not towards something supernatural, but towards something that may be just as astonishing. The possibility that nature has been quietly handling this question all along, hidden in plain sight. After a while, the question stops feeling abstract. It becomes personal. You begin noticing the same visitors returning to the yard day after day. One blue jay lands on the fence every morning just after the sun clears the trees. Another prefers the highest branch of the old maple, arriving a few minutes later as though following an invisible schedule. At first, they are simply birds passing through. But time has a strange way of changing ordinary things. The more often you see them, the harder it becomes to think of them as strangers. You start recognizing small details. The way one tilts its head before calling. The way another pauses for a moment before crossing the yard. Tiny behaviors. Fleeting moments. Things most people would never notice. Yet somehow they begin to matter. A morning feels different when they are there. Quieter when they are not. And without meaning to, you start carrying them with you. On busy afternoons. On long drives. Even during moments when you are nowhere near the yard. Then one day, standing near the window, coffee warming your hands, another thought quietly arrives. Every familiar bird you see today was once completely unknown to you. And every familiar bird you remember from years ago has already slipped into the past. The realization carries no sadness, only perspective, because the connection was always temporary. A shared season, a shared morning, a shared stretch of sunlight across a branch. Perhaps that is why people feel so drawn to birds in the first place. They remind us to pay attention, to notice small things before they disappear back into the flow of ordinary life. And the more closely you watch, the more you begin to sense that the mystery is no longer only about where they go. It is about how deeply they become part of our lives before we ever realize it. And this is where the mystery begins to widen beyond a single backyard. Because the moment you start paying attention, you realize the pattern is not limited to the birds you know. It stretches far beyond the fence line, beyond your neighborhood, beyond the town where you live. Every morning, Across forests, suburbs, farmland, and city parks, countless birds greet the day. Blue feathers flash through oak trees in Missouri. Calls echo from maples in Pennsylvania. Wings move through coastal woods in North Carolina. The landscape feels full, alive, continuous. Yet, beneath that familiar rhythm, something else is happening. Quietly, constantly. Generations pass through the same trees without leaving obvious traces behind. The branch remains. The morning sunlight remains. The wind follows the same path through the leaves. But the birds themselves are always changing. One season gives way to the next. One life blends into another so seamlessly that the transition is almost impossible to see. Sometimes, standing outside at dawn, it feels as though the same birds have always been there. The same calls. The same movements. The same flashes of blue against green leaves. But of course they have not. What you are witnessing is continuity, not permanence. Nature has become so skilled at renewing itself that it creates the illusion that nothing ever changes. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. Not that things disappear, but that the world keeps feeling whole afterward. The maple tree still fills with song. The feeder still attracts visitors. The morning still arrives wrapped in gold light. Everything continues as though guided by an invisible hand, maintaining the balance. And once you begin to see that pattern, another question quietly emerges from the shadows. If the landscape remains full, while individual lives pass through it, what exactly is happening in the moments when those lives leave the stage and the world carries on without missing a beat? Perhaps that is why so many people find themselves thinking about these questions long after the birds have disappeared into the trees for the evening. Not because they are searching for answers in the usual sense, but because something about the mystery touches a deeper part of us. Many people believe that nature has a way of teaching the same lesson over and over through different forms. A river flowing around a stone, autumn leaves drifting to the ground, morning fog dissolving with the first sunlight. Nothing stays exactly as it was, and yet somehow the world remains complete. Standing in the yard, watching the last light settle across the branches, it becomes easier to understand why certain moments linger in memory. A familiar bird arrives for months, perhaps even years. Then one day, it no longer appears. There is no announcement, no clear ending, only a quiet absence that gradually reveals itself over time. Researchers might describe this as a normal part of ecological cycles, and they would be right. But there is another layer to the experience that statistics alone do not fully capture. Something about it feels difficult to ignore, because the human heart has always searched for meaning in departures, in changes, in the spaces left behind when something familiar is no longer there. Maybe that is why people pause when they notice an empty branch that used to hold a daily visitor. Maybe that is why certain memories return unexpectedly years later. Not because there is anything supernatural taking place, but because the natural world is constantly reminding us of something we already know. That presence is precious precisely because it is temporary. And this is where the mystery begins to feel larger than birds alone. Because hidden within it is a question about every living thing that passes through our lives, leaving traces that remain long after the visible presence is gone. As evening settles across the yard, the questions no longer feel urgent. They drift more slowly now, moving through the mind the way shadows move across the grass at the end of the day. The maple tree stands where it always has. The fence catches the last traces of sunlight. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird call rises and fades into the growing quiet. And for a moment, nothing seems to be happening at all. Yet somehow, everything feels different than it did that morning. Perhaps because you have begun to see the landscape not as a collection of separate moments, but as part of something continuous. The blue jays that visit the yard, the branches that hold them, the changing seasons, the years slipping quietly past. All of it connected in ways that are easy to overlook when life moves too fast. There is a strange comfort in that realization, not because it answers every question. It does not. If anything, it leaves some mysteries exactly where they belong, but it softens them. The way twilight softens the edges of familiar objects. Standing at the window, watching the evening light fade from the leaves, you begin to understand that not everything meaningful leaves visible evidence behind. Some things are known only through their presence while they are here. A familiar call outside the kitchen window. A flash of blue crossing the yard. A routine so ordinary that you barely notice it until one day you do. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the value of these moments was never in how long they lasted. Maybe it was simply that they happened at all. The yard grows quieter. The branches settle into stillness. And somewhere, within that stillness, a deeper appreciation begins to take shape, gentle and unspoken, like something that had been waiting patiently to be noticed. The next morning arrives, much like the one where this journey began. Soft light filters through the trees. The grass glistens with traces of dew. Somewhere beyond the yard, a distant bird call drifts through the cool air. And there, on the familiar branch near the edge of the maple, a flash of blue appears once again. For a moment, everything feels unchanged. The world continues. The seasons continue. Life continues. Yet, now you see something you may not have noticed before. The branch was never important because the same bird stayed there forever. It was important because, for a brief moment in time, two lives shared the same morning, yours and theirs. That is the hidden truth quietly waiting beneath all of this. The landscape remains full not because nothing leaves, but because everything belongs to something larger than itself. The birds, the trees, the wind moving through the leaves, even the silence between their calls, all of it part of a story that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone. Perhaps that is why these small encounters stay with us, not because they solve a mystery, but because they remind us that wonder still exists in ordinary places. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If you enjoy journeys like this, quiet mysteries hidden in the natural world, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless things around us that most people pass by without ever truly seeing. And somewhere beyond your window tonight, beneath the stars and beyond the reach of porch lights and city streets, the story is still unfolding. A branch sways in the dark. Leaves whisper in the wind. Something small and feathered settles into the night. Maybe it is only another ordinary moment in nature, but somehow it never feels like only that. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that it never has.